I still remember the smell of pine and cinnamon in my father's living room that Christmas, and how everything felt warm on the outside while something cold sat heavy in my chest. I had flown in late the night before, tired but hopeful, telling myself that this year would be different, that maybe my dad and I would finally talk like we used to. I had no idea that by the end of that day, he would take everything he thought I deserved away from me, right there under the soft glow of Christmas lights. Growing up, my father was the kind of man everyone respected. He built his success from nothing, started a small real estate firm that grew into something massive, and by the time I was in college, people spoke his name like it meant power. To the world, he was generous, disciplined, and fair. To me, he was distant but predictable, strict but not cruel, at least not when I was younger. I was his only child, and even though he wasn't affectionate, I always believed that deep down he was proud of me. My mother died when I was 16, and after that, something in our relationship shifted. He became harder, quieter, like he locked away every soft part of himself and threw away the key. I learned not to ask questions and not to push. I focused on school, then work, building my own life without asking him for help. I married young, divorced quietly, and never once went back to him for money, even when things were tight. I wanted him to see that I could stand on my own. That Christmas, I came home because he asked me to. His voice on the phone had been calm, almost formal, when he said, "I want us all together this year. There are things we need to discuss." I assumed he meant family updates, maybe plans for the new year, or even something about his health. The thought of inheritance never crossed my mind. I didn't think in those terms, not with him still alive and sitting across from me at the dinner table. The house looked the same as always, large and perfectly kept, with decorations placed just right like they were part of a display rather than a home. When I walked in, he hugged me briefly, one arm, stiff and quick, then stepped back to look at me. "You look tired," he said, not unkindly, just observant. I smiled and told him the flight was long, and that was the end of it. We fell into that familiar silence, moving around each other carefully like strangers who shared memories, but not feelings. Dinner was quiet. He talked about business, about markets shifting, about how careful people needed to be these days. I nodded, asked polite questions, played the role of the daughter who listened. At one point, he looked at me and said, "You know, I always expected more from you." He said it casually, like a comment about the weather, but it landed hard. I felt my face grow warm, but I didn't argue. I just said, "I'm doing my best," and went back to my food. After dessert, he asked me to follow him into his study. That alone should have warned me. That room was where serious conversations happened, the kind you didn't forget. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. Then he opened a folder on his desk, thick and neatly organized, and said words I still hear clearly in my head. "I've made some changes to my estate planning, and I want you to hear it from me." I felt my stomach drop, but I stayed quiet. He explained, slowly and carefully, that he believed I lacked discipline, that my life choices showed poor judgment, and that he didn't trust me to handle significant wealth responsibly. He told me he had disinherited me, removing me as a beneficiary from his estate, which he estimated at around $3 million. He said it was for my own good, that hardship builds character, and that I would thank him one day. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I just sat there, listening, nodding as if he were explaining a business decision instead of cutting me out of his life. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked almost relieved. "I hope you understand," he said. I told him I did, even though my hands were shaking and I could barely breathe. I left the study feeling numb, walked back into the living room where the Christmas tree still twinkled, and suddenly everything felt fake. The lights, the music, the quiet snowfall outside the window, all of it felt like a scene from someone else's life. I packed my bag that night, hugged him goodbye the next morning, and drove away without looking back. He thought that was the end of it. What he didn't know was that years earlier, I had quietly become the one holding the real power, and Christmas was only the beginning. The drive back home was a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel too tightly and replaying his words over and over in my head, wondering how a father could look at his own child and decide she wasn't worth trusting. When I got home, I sat on my couch in the dark for a long time, still wearing my coat, listening to the silence. That's when the pain finally hit, sharp and overwhelming, and I cried harder than I had in years, not just for the money, but for the final proof that I would never be enough for him. As the shock faded, anger took its place, slow and steady. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that sharpens your thoughts and makes you see things clearly. I started replaying memories I had ignored before, moments that felt small at the time but now seemed loaded with meaning. The way he always asked me about paperwork, about signatures, about whether I understood what I was signing. The way he insisted I attend certain meetings just to observe. At the time, I thought he was testing me, maybe even trying to teach me something. Years earlier, after my divorce, he had called me into that same study and told me he wanted to protect his assets. He said lawsuits, remarriages, and bad decisions could destroy everything he built, and that he needed someone he trusted to help safeguard it. He framed it as a temporary arrangement, a technical thing, and I agreed because I trusted him. I didn't fully understand it then, but I listened to the lawyers, signed what they told me to sign, and asked questions when I didn't understand. That night, after Christmas, I pulled out the old files I had stored away and never really looked at again. I spread them across my dining table and started reading, slowly this time, with fresh eyes. That's when the truth came into focus, piece by piece. The trust he talked about protecting, the one holding the bulk of his assets, wasn't his alone anymore. Years ago, he had named me as the primary trustee with full control over distributions, investments, and amendments under certain conditions he had clearly triggered himself. My hands trembled as I read the language again and again, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. He had disinherited me from his personal estate, yes, but the trust sat outside of that will, untouched by his dramatic declaration. And because of a clause he'd barely paid attention to at the time, I didn't need his approval anymore. I wasn't just a beneficiary, I was the one holding the keys. The next few days were a mix of exhaustion and clarity. I met with an attorney, quietly, without drama, and laid everything out. He confirmed what I already suspected, that legally, his father's announcement meant very little in the larger picture. He had assumed control and ownership were the same thing. They weren't. The law didn't care about his feelings or his Christmas speech. It cared about documents, dates, and signatures. I didn't rush. I didn't call him or confront him. I needed to think, to decide what I wanted, not just legally, but also emotionally. Part of me wanted to expose him, to call him and tell him he was wrong, to hear his voice crack when he realized his mistake. Another part of me wanted distance, peace, and a clean break. I realized then that revenge didn't have to be loud to be powerful. A week later, he called me. His tone was casual, almost smug, like he expected me to be struggling already. He asked how I was doing, whether I had thought about what he said, and if I understood why he made his decision. I told him I understood perfectly. That seemed to satisfy him. He reminded me that he hoped I would learn from this and finally grow up. I ended the call politely, thanked him for his honesty, and hung up with a calm I didn't feel before. That was the moment I decided how this would end. I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't argue, I would simply do what the trust allowed me to do, quietly and correctly. I began restructuring assets, moving funds, securing everything in a way that aligned with the trust's purpose, and protected it from impulsive decisions, including his. Every step was legal, documented, and irreversible. By the time he realized what was happening, it would already be done. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, about a month after Christmas. I was at home drinking tea and reviewing paperwork when my phone lit up with his name. I answered calmly, already knowing what he was going to say. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. He asked me if I had made changes to the trust, and I told him I had, using the authority he gave me years ago. There was a long pause. The kind that stretches until it feels uncomfortable. And then his tone shifted. He demanded explanations, accused me of going behind his back, of manipulating him, of trying to punish him for being honest. I listened without interrupting, letting him say everything he needed to say. When he finally stopped, I told him the truth, simply and clearly. I told him he disinherited me out of spite and control, and in doing so, he activated protections he never bothered to understand. He tried to regain control, threatened legal action, told me he would fix this. I told him he was free to try, but that the law was very clear. The trust was secure, the assets protected, and his personal will didn't change that. For the first time in my life, I heard uncertainty in his voice. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. He realized then that the power dynamic he relied on was gone. We met in person one last time, in that same study where he thought he ended my future. He looked older, smaller somehow, like the weight of his mistake had finally settled on him. He asked me why I did it, why I couldn't just accept his decision. I told him I accepted it completely, and that this wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. I said I was doing exactly what he taught me to do, protect what mattered and not let emotions ruin everything. After that, our relationship changed, not with shouting or drama, but with distance. He stopped calling as often, the authority in his voice faded, replaced by careful politeness. I didn't feel joy watching that happen, just a quiet sense of balance being restored. I used the trust to support causes my mother cared about, to invest thoughtfully, and to ensure that if there was ever a future generation, they wouldn't grow up learning love through control. Looking back now, I understand that Christmas wasn't about money at all. It was about power and who was allowed to hold it. My father tried to teach me a lesson by taking something away, and instead he taught me who I was without him. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means reading the fine print, trusting yourself, and walking away knowing you were never as powerless as they wanted you to believe.